Alrighty. Well, with that being said, let's jump straight in to this Kevin O'Connor interview. So I'll read my four main takeaways that I wrote down, Ethan, and then you can kind of bounce your ideas off of them and then tell me some of your takeaways that are maybe different.
Let's do it.
First thing I'll start off with is at the end of the episode, Kevin kind of starts asking him, hey, like with how good you already are, there's a
Mhm.
lot of discussion around the league. And there's also just like with the way that he's changing the game in a sense defensively, let's say. He's like, you're also changing, the Spurs, what's the word? I guess just the way that the Spurs have always operated. But regardless of the Spurs maybe making a flashy move or not this offseason, really what he's getting at is when you add a player like Victor Wembanyama, that completely throws a wrench in everything that you had planned prior. And we've talked about that. And so basically, what he said is because of how good you are, do you think that that's impacting the timeline? Do you think that's accelerating, what the Spurs want to do? And he kind of did a two-way answer, I would say, Ethan, because it seemed like his answer was basically yes, but then he also says, I'm talking, I've been hit up by a lot of prospects. So he's not saying he's getting hit up by a lot of current NBA players per se, but
Mhm.
he is saying that, they are trying to add, talent around him definitely faster. So I just thought that was an interesting kind of conversation and question there. It was, probably only like a 2-minute clip. Um,
Mhm.
but it really did, despite him saying prospects there, Ethan, it really did feel like they're alluding to the timeline accelerating. And when I say that, I'm not saying they're going to go and trade Devin and Keldon tomorrow to get Paul George or something. Like I'm just throwing that out of the thin air. Obviously, maybe that wouldn't work, but they're not going to go just, trade like some of their key pieces that they've been building or like a Jeremy, for example, immediately just to go get another like current all-star or previous all-star level player. Um,
Mhm.
but at the same time, I think from Wemby's answer, you could tell that they know he knows what he is, and I think he knew that before he even came to the league. And I know this is a long diatribe, Ethan. I'm going to get to, I swear. But now the Spurs know what he is, and that's kind of how we opened up the off season and regular season preview that we did last episode. We opened up the show with that. Like now we know kind of what the Spurs have in Victor and have an idea of potentially the directions that they could go. Um, I I don't think that it's going to. My takeaway from that clip was I don't think it's going to be necessarily a super big splash move. And you've kind of talked about this, but at the same time, I think they are going to start making some moves to better the talent around him or better the infrastructure, maybe is a better way to put it.
I would say that that's a definite. It kind of coincides with what recently came out in the anonymous players poll, where he was just narrowly beat out Nikola Jokic for player that most NBA players want to play with. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what he was saying in that interview. And I know he said the word prospects, but I think he kind of meant kind of like what you said, like NBA players too. Like he may have consciously chose that word to be safe, but it felt like he was talking about current players as well. Um, and my stance has been pretty consistent on this. I think what you just said is true. I don't know if it'll be a big splashy free agency play, like just to name a couple guys, Clay Thompson, Paul George. Like those are great names. Like they
Right.
fit probably with the Spurs and all this stuff. But I think it's more likely going to be just a real solid veteran piece that could elevate the maturity of the team, be a plug and play guy, develop some of our younger talent, and also elevate us to win some more games. I don't think that this is going to be a 39-year-old, PJ Tucker who
Right.
like I don't think that that's who I'm talking about. I think I don't want to grab a name because I don't want to be stuck to what I say
Right.
here, but just a real solid piece that can start or be a significant role player that elevates the rest of the guys and increases the competitive nature of some of these games.
Yeah, and not to harp on the same point that I've harped on before on this show, Ethan, but I'll go back to the Rockets solo post game that you did late in the year, where
Mhm.
they're just and obviously Wemby had a little bit of an ankle injury. They even mentioned
Right.
that a little bit in the podcast. They talked about this game, not necessarily what we're about to get into, but I'm just remembering that as we're talking about it. Um, they clogged the paint so much and forced Trey Jones and Jeremy Sohan,
Mhm.
to make threes. You just want to have guys in those situations. They're not necessarily maybe going to be all stars, but not necessarily a Doug McDermott either. As much as we love our boy Doug, you want kind of two-way guys in that scenario where they're going to be able to knock down shots, but they're not going to be a liability on defense either. And that's really the definition of 3 and D, which
Mhm.
is kind of maybe what you would want surrounded at those positions. But because the roster is so young as well, I think there's a lot of flexibility there. Like it doesn't have to just be a 3 and D player, but someone with those traits in their arsenal.
First name I think of, I know he's going to be a free agent. I don't know if it's unrestricted or not. I think it is. Uh, Contavious Caldwell Pope, and I know I've talked about him at length before, but I think he's a great guy that fits at that three spot to maybe take Julian's position and kind of elevate our maturity level. Do everything that you just talked about. Not a big name, but definitely a piece that can help us in those situations.
Yeah, as much as people might be like, "Oh, it's just KCP." I mean, look what he did on the Lakers, and then look what he did on the Nuggets, and how integral he's been, and the
Hmm.
type of plays he's made in some of the stretch runs. I mean, look at the dunk he just had the other night. I mean, anyways, I
Hmm.
mean, the playoffs have been awesome. We haven't talked
They
about that.
really have, dude. They've been
They-
fantastic.
and honestly, as much as we want the Spurs to be there,
Hmm.
now that we have Victor, and this little side note here, and we're like, if we feel good, about the future of the franchise.
Oh yeah.
So it's been really nice. It's unlike last year where it's like, I'm just sitting here waiting until the lottery to see if we can potentially get this guy
Hmm.
to save our franchise, right? That's the way we're looking at it. Um,
Hmm.
this year we know we have him, and I can just sit back and just enjoy these playoffs because the Spurs aren't playing.
Right.
And so, yeah, I've been really enjoying like these first couple rounds, even more so than last year. And I think a little bit of that also has to do, not to go off on a playoffs tangent here, but I think a little bit of that has to do with kind of the the coming out party, if you will, for the next generation of the league, whether that's Jokic, Anthony Edwards. I know the Magic are down 0-2, but the fact they're even in the playoffs,
Hmm.
um, you see what the
Dante DiVincenzo, baby.
I was about to say, you see what the Knicks are doing as well with with Julius Randle out. I could go on and on, but Wemby is a part of this new era that's being ushered into the NBA. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's another thing that interview was centered around in a lot of ways. Um, and man, one of the things probably that frustrated us this season is we wanted to see more of Wemby at times when it comes to that minutes restriction at the beginning of the year. And here's where I just want to, as much as Pop in the front office are worthy of criticism, 100%. This is the type of stuff where, like, even in the moment where Victor's frustrated, now that the season's over and he's sitting down talking to Kevin O'Connor, he can look back at the season from a 20,000 foot perspective. And he said, I trusted the minutes restriction. And as much as it was frustrating at times, I wouldn't have had it any other way because it helped my body adapt to the NBA in the way that it needs to for me to have the career that I want. Because it was as much as we've had the conversation of the Euro League being more physical whenever it comes to the rule set and
Hmm.
things of that nature. The athlete in the NBA is a different caliber of physicality that he had to adjust to. And
Hmm.
what was one of the biggest things that we didn't even really talk about this year, Ethan, going into last season? His longevity. We didn't think he was going to play as many games as he did. The trainer being brought on staff. Is there going to be an injury problem with his frame? The way that situation was handled, basically what I took away from the Kevin O'Connor interview is
Hmm.
by doing that, they handled that exactly the way that they're supposed to. And I know that's easy for me to say as a Spurs fan, but when that's coming from Victor's mouth and you remember when he was in press conferences expressing his frustration about it, and now
Hmm.
he's like, I wouldn't have done it any other way, and I'm really glad we did that as much as my competitiveness, was eating at me. I
Mhm.
think that's really telling whenever it just comes to, you know, and not to bring this up, but there have been, some little chirps and birds kind of since the Kawhi situation of do the Spurs still have it? Does Pop still have it? And, I don't think super accredited people. Not saying necessarily us when I say that, but like the Brian Windhorsts or the Kevin O'Connors of the world, we're ever questioning Greg Popovich and the Spurs front office's motives and how they handle things. Look at Sam Presti. I mean, he's the
Mhm.
example of the type of people that they build and how that's translated, into modern roster building. Um, but what I'm trying to get to here is they still know what they're doing whenever it comes to managing a superstar like this. And obviously, that's just the injury aspect, but I think it's telling to the rest of the way that they're managing him, which not to just say everything that was said in this interview, but I'll finish this and then get your thoughts on this, Ethan. Is he also talked about how there's mutual conversation between him and the front office, when it comes to decision making for the team. And I believe there was an article or report or something that came out before the season even ended talking about that. But still, to hear it from the horse's mouth in this interview, and I believe that was kind of right after he talked about teaming up with prospects or players, getting
Mhm.
messages from them. Um, it's just another aspect of how a player like him is going to get some say. It's just like as much as I could sit here and be like, oh, this you know, uh, La GM decision on the Lakers with Russell Westbrook, I didn't like. Those type of players, like a LeBron, like a Victor, they get a say in the front office, and the
Mhm.
Spurs are managing that. And it seems like he's very satisfied with where he's at. But he's also like, yeah, I'm going to give him my input, but also like he obviously has a lot of respect for them as well.
Yeah, a phrase he and Pop have used frequently in post game conferences. I don't think he used it in this Kevin O'Connor interview. Was it's a partnership, right? It's not a one way street either way. Um, so it's reassuring that these conversations are going on, and for people that are going to say negative things about it because it's the new era of players, young players being entitled or whatever.
Right.
This has been going on forever. Like I'm almost positive Tim Duncan had a say when free agency came around on who came around, who wasn't. Same with Manu, Tony. Like this is how San Antonio has kind of always run. Is almost like a no pun intended a mom and pop sort of thing, where it's a constant conversation between the best players and Coach Popovich, RC Buford, et cetera, et cetera. So it's extremely reassuring. It shows the maturity level of him not to abuse this power that he has and to openly talk about it, but openly also kind of push it slightly down as if to say, like, I'm still the player. I love all the language that he used. I love his approach to these kind of questions. And I love what you said about, players maybe thinking after the Kawhi situation that Spurs front office, Spurs organization isn't the same as it used to be. But again, the player anonymous poll, who is the number one coach that everyone wants to play for? Coach Popovich. So clearly, he still has a lot of pull with his legendary coaching status amongst the players, not even just his fellow coaches, but the players as well. So that shouldn't be a worry. And if you remove the Kawhi situation, and there's still a lot that no one knows, that no one will ever know about that situation just because of the nature of Spurs front office. But if you remove just that issue, it's been a perfectly clean record of how we treat our players, how our medical staff interacts with players, 100% class, et cetera, et cetera. So um, it speaks volumes that Wemby has had this kind of interaction thus far into his career, and it also speaks to his maturity that um, he's able to zoom out, like you said, and look at this from the 7'4" perspective. Once his competitive juices have kind of depleted because the season's over, and he's like, you know what, that was smart. I'm glad that we did that.
I like the 7'4" view. That
You
was
like
really
that?
good there, Ethan. Okay, Alejandro Morales, one of our SSPN OGs, is in here. He says Spolstra Pop was second. I believe he was first last year. I might be wrong.
Hmm.
I had a friend send me the poll
Mhm.
recently. Okay, it was Spolstra this year, but Pop
Darn.
was Pop was second. And I'm sure if Alejandro is saying he was first last year, that's the case. And also the other thing I want to mention, it's Spolstra at 20%, Pop at 18%, and
Mm,
then Steve Kerr at 9%. Um,
mm.
so there's a big drop
Big
off
gap.
after Spoelstra and Greg. And the other thing is, and when I got that text from another friend of mine who's a reporter up at Missouri, actually, he was like, "This is pretty crazy, like considering there's been 5 years missed in the playoffs." But everybody understands the circumstances and in the situation. Um, that's kind of happened. And this is kind
Right.
of showing that people in the NBA know that. And I think when you add Victor to the roster, that probably increases the amount of votes for Pop too.
Oh, for sure. And if you want to say that the Spurs were in a bad situation after Kawhi for however many years, like, sure. But he also, not to rehash bad blood, but Kawhi left us kind of in a really bad situation in terms of rebuilding or staying competitive. Like, we were right in the middle of like which direction to go. So I don't blame the Spurs totally on how we played that out. And also, if you look at who we drafted, like, we drafted some good players. They just weren't like superstar players. DeJounte, Derek White, just to name a Lonnie Walker. Like, these are all like solid guys. They're just not like the number one option. Now we have Victor. If we brought those guys back, knock on wood, but maybe, it'd probably be a different situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally get what you're saying there. Um, Getting to another aspect, I've really kind of got to most of my points on this Kevin O'Connor interview. But the last thing, and this is something I've also said before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself,
No, you're fine.
but in this 50-minute interview, and I know there was the JJ Redick one before the season, and I had a very similar sentiment, but he's a year older, he's a year more experienced in the league. The way that he's wired, the between the ears,
Mm-hmm.
the way I wrote it down on my notes was philosophical mindset and maturity.
Yeah.
Um, I don't mean this in a bad way, Ethan. I think he's just years ahead of his time. But I'm listening to this interview and I'm like, my guy is more mentally mature than me. Like, that's really what it feels like. And,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably what it takes to be someone of his caliber, at the level that he's at. He's definitely not just, you can tell he's not just, and this isn't just because we're Spurs fans. Like, everybody can tell this. I have friends that aren't Spurs fans that can tell this. He's not just a special basketball player. Like, he's a
Mm-hmm.
special human being. And he wants that for other people too. There was a point where Kevin O'Connor was referencing last year when he was on JJ Redick's show, and he said he was free in the universe. And then
Mm-hmm.
JJ was like, "I wish I was free in the universe." And Wemby goes, "You are." Like, and Kevin O'Connor specifically hit on the "you are" part. Like, what did you mean by that? And he was just saying that he basically just said he believes like every human being has the potential to do great things, and we just have to kind of hone that. And we have to, like, I mean, he went on like a whole diatribe of like
Mm-hmm.
facing your trauma, like facing your fears. And he's like, I didn't even have that much trauma growing up. He's like, but things that happened to you as a kid, like, it makes an imprint on you and you've got to
Mm-hmm.
face that. You can't, stuff it down. And for him to have that perspective on like emotional intelligence, like, I'm listening to this and I'm like, you know what I mean? Like I've got this, not to go completely off topic here, Ethan, but I've got this genetics book for myself that I've had for like a year now, and it's called "It Didn't Start With You." And it has a lot to do with like how your bloodline and your parents like impact your life. Anyways, not to go into that whole like and can influence who you are and how you react to things. So when Wemby's talking about that, I'm like recalling stuff in that book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, and that's stuff like I just learned, like, a couple years ago. And it's like almost reframed my perspective on a lot of things in life. That is not where I expected this podcast to go today, Ethan, but it's an example of how when I'm listening to him talk about this stuff, I'm like, wow, like, there is some human intelligence in here that is very unique. That's what I'll say.
No, his personality is so extremely unique because, usually if a guy's outspoken, willing to talk to the media, kind of like he is, um, it's because of like a overconfidence, almost selfish way. Like, it's never well read. It doesn't come across as like a well read person. But he's got like the Tim Duncan esque calmness to him, but with the ability to speak his mind at 19 or 20 now.
Yeah.
That's like you said, so incredibly beyond his years. And I don't want to repeat everything that you just said, so I'll finish with this point. What I liked a lot about how he spoke was anytime he talked about the losing streak, the tough times last year, things that to improve on, his feelings about the team, it was always put in we, us, the team, everybody, his teammates. It was never like me. It was always about how we can get better, how we can improve, how we struggled. And that, and for someone that's English is his second language,
Right.
that was big for me. As I say, for me, um, that is how he's thinking about the team and not just solely about his individual play.
I think that's a really good point because this is reminding me of another thing in that interview when he's like, when people tell you, and Kevin O'Connor was basically like, I think you can be the greatest player of all time, like to his face. And he's
Mm-hmm.
like, what goes through your mind, like when people say that? And he just kind of like, he's like, not really much. He's like, it doesn't really,
Mm-hmm.
like, he was like, it doesn't really affect me at all. He's like, and then he's basically says, he's like, all my expectations are for myself, are what I care about. And my expectations like exceed what everybody's saying, basically by like a lot.
Yeah.
is what he was saying. He didn't tell you exactly what those expectations were, but it was just like, dude,
Mm-hmm.
I've never like for someone at his age with the amount of hype that he has, the amount of attention he's gotten, um, for him to have that perspective and the maturity, like I said, that's also a testament to his parents too. Like
Mm-hmm.
seriously, shout out to them.
Yeah, it's the self assurance. It's incredible at his age.
Any other final thoughts from this interview, Ethan?
Just gets me all the more excited for next year, Jude. All the more excited.